So I'm Sam, and I'm with Octopart, and this mic is not working. Is this mic with the camera? Great. So Octopart is a search engine for electronic parts. So if you are looking for semiconductor chips or designing a better microphone and you need a piezoelectronic transducer, you're going to use Octopart to find that part. Today I want to talk about best practices for electronic component procurement. We started back in 2007, and in the past 7 years we've learned a lot about electronic component procurement because we work really closely with component distributors and component manufacturers. Okay. I'm going to give up on the mic. So, like I said, we work really closely with component distributors and component manufacturers. Can you hear me in the back? Great. And so we've learned a lot about procurement, how to find parts, what are some of the best strategies to finding parts when you're in different phases of the product design lifecycle. So this is what I'm going to talk about. Is how to get a hold of parts when you're in the design phase. As I'm sure many of you are right now, you're thinking about new ideas, you're developing new products. When you're doing prototyping, so you're buying relatively small quantities of parts. When you move into production and you're buying larger quantities. And the last thing I'm going to talk about are hard to find parts. How to find hard to find parts. So let's start with the design phase. Procurement for design. So I threw up a bunch of acronyms up here, and I'll start talking about them. PCN stands for Product Change Notice. So let's say you've got this great idea for a much better wireless microphone, and you've designed in this transducer for the mic, and you're about to go into production, and you find out that there's a product change notice, and actually the mic is going to run at a different voltage, or it's going to be slightly different size, and it's not going to work, and you're going to get a broken microphone. You don't want to find that out when you go into production. You want to find that out when you're doing design. And so that's why things like product change notices are really important to keep abreast of. Another document that's put out by component manufacturers are EOL notices, or end-of-life notices. This is a document where the component manufacturer is stating that, hey, this component, we're no longer going to make it anymore. It could be because we're mothballing that product line. It could be because there's a better part that you should use instead. And these are also documents that you want to keep on top of. What you don't want to happen is you don't want to get into production and find out that when you want to buy 10,000 of these parts, that they've gone end of life. Then you have to go back and you have to start the whole design cycle again, and you're in big trouble. The last weird acronym is NRND, which stands for Not Recommended for New Designs. So this is a term that component manufacturers will use when they are either mothballing a part, or they've come out with a part that's better, or a part that's going to be in production for longer. So this is something you also want to keep track of. Now, where do you find all of this information? The answer is that there's a bunch of places. We have some of this information on Octopart, but really most of this information, in fact all of this information, comes from the manufacturer. And so the best place to get it is directly from the manufacturer themselves. You can find it on their web pages. If you have a salesperson or a contact at the manufacturer, these are things that are really good to talk about very early on in the design stage. And lastly, I want to talk about single sources and finding parts that seem to match exactly what you need, but maybe they're brand new parts. It's not clear how well they are embedded in the supply chain. You don't know if they're going to be hard to get when you go into production. And if you have the option to use a much more common part, a more general part, maybe it's a more expensive part, you might consider using that more general part, because you don't want to run into that situation where this very specific part that does exactly what you need and it really scratches your engineer's itch you might consider going for the more general, commonly used part so you don't run into a situation where you can't get it when you're trying to go into production. And feel free to jump in and ask me any questions or comments anytime. So that's the design phase. And let's say you come up with a great design and you're ready to start building this thing. You want to come to Hardwired NYC, show it off, talk to people about it, and you want to start building. So let's start talking about building small volumes of prototypes. When you're ready to start building small volumes, oftentimes you'll go to online distributors that specialize in small volume component sales. These are distributors like DigiKey, Mouser, Newark. They have websites you can put in your credit card. You can get parts the next day. You can also get a sense of what the rough availabilities of these parts look like. You can also go to Octopart, and we'll show you what the up-to-date stock and availability is for lots of different manufacturers, which can be a good proxy for finding out if this is a commonly stocked part. A new trend that we're actually seeing that's starting to happen is that we're seeing component manufacturers start to sell components directly to engineers and for prototyping. So Microchip Direct is a distribution arm of Microchip. Maxim is starting to sell directly. Renesas is selling directly. And this is a good way to start building relationships with component manufacturers when you're in the early stages. Because a lot of the procurement process does come down to relationships and making sure that you kind of get the inside story about what availability parts is going to look like 6 months into the future or a year into the future when you're ready to go into production. Lastly, sometimes contract manufacturers can be really helpful at the prototyping stage. In particular, quick-turn contract manufacturers, I'll call them. And these tend to be contract manufacturers that work at relatively lower volumes, and many of them are here in the US, and that allows you to have really fast iteration cycles when you're developing prototypes. You can outsource the procurement of parts to the contract manufacturer, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. That's a good way for you to focus on other stuff besides buying parts and stocking parts. Because the parts need to go to the contract manufacturer anyway. They have existing relationships. This can be a good opportunity for you to let them handle procurement at the prototyping stage. And so once you've got your prototype running, you're ready to start scaling up production, let's talk about procurement at the production stage. And this is a very broad description, right? You can do production at the level of 1,000 pieces, 10,000 pieces, 100,000 pieces, millions of pieces, and the story really changes as you go through that spectrum. So starting at the smaller production stages, buying online can still be a viable way to get parts. Online distributors will offer you price breaks at larger quantities, and you can buy entire reels and get decent prices if you're building on the order of thousands or a couple thousands of pieces. As you scale up, though, it really helps to build relationships with salespeople at the component distributors and also build relationships with salespeople at the component manufacturers. And distributors like Arrow and Avnet are larger volume distributors. DigiKey as well is getting into this space where they want to support manufacturing as it goes from smaller quantities to larger and larger quantities. And having a salesperson at a distributor will often let you get better pricing than what you're going to find on the web. The reason is because if you can convince the distributor that your product is really going to blow up, it's really going to get big and popular, then they go back to the manufacturer and say, look, I know this product is small right now, but I have faith that this is going to get big. And if we can give this person really good pricing, now we're going to get your part designed in to this new device. And the manufacturer of the components has an incentive to give you really good pricing because their incentive to get their part designed in, to get that lock-in, to get that design win, it's called. So building relationships and talking to salespeople at distributors is important. I just talked about buying direct, building relationships with manufacturers. Payment terms is another thing to keep in mind. As you build out relationships with component manufacturers and component distributors, oftentimes you can get better terms than having to pay right away, like you have to do when you buy online from DigiKey and you put in your credit card. Oftentimes you can get maybe net 30, net 60, maybe even better payment terms, which can be a real benefit to your cash flow as you go into production. Contract manufacturers, as I mentioned on the previous slide, they can help at the production stage 2 with what's called turnkey manufacturing, where you outsource all the procurement to the contract manufacturer. They handle the relationships with the distributors. They have pre-existing relationships, and they can save you a lot of time that you can spend working on the next iteration of your product. There's trade-offs to that as well, because then you're a little bit removed from the supply chain, but it all depends on the relationship you have with your contract manufacturer. It can also be a big benefit. It really depends on the types of parts you're buying, on your relationships, and what kind of what your timeline looks like. Lastly, I just wanted to make a quick note about what happens to parts after production. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're building 10,000 pieces, but you've gone ahead and you've bought a reel of 20,000 microcontrollers. Well, now you have this excess stock of 10,000. You have a partial reel. What happens to this partial reel? This is a conversation you should be having with your contract manufacturer before you go into production, because you don't want a situation where you assumed that you would be able to use that second half of the reel as you do the next production run. The contract manufacturer might want to use that for a totally different customer. It might not even be clear who owns it, and that's something you really need to straighten out before you go into production. And finally, I want to talk about hard-to-find parts. So far I've talked about distributors. I've talked about authorized distributors. That means distributors that are buying directly from the component manufacturers. When it comes to finding hard-to-find parts, oftentimes they're stocked by independent distributors or by brokers that are not buying directly from the manufacturer, from the original manufacturer of the components, but they might be buying up excess inventory. And whenever you get into a situation where you're buying excess inventory and the provenance of these parts becomes cloudy, you run into the risk of getting counterfeit parts, which is a very big problem. For example, you could get into a situation where a part is purchased from excess from a contract manufacturer, but the buyer really wants a slightly higher grade of that part, maybe a military spec grade. And you can get into a situation where an unscrupulous dealer would remark the parts, which is illegal and it can be very dangerous. So if you're buying from independent distributors or through brokers, this is something you need to keep in mind. A lot of this comes down, like I said, I keep coming back to this, building relationships with the distributors and also with brokers, because many brokers are great because they're able to bring liquidity to the market and get these parts off of the shelves. They do third-party testing. Some of them will X-ray the parts for you to really verify that these are legitimate parts. And it really comes down to building a relationship and building trust between you and the broker that you're working with to find hard-to-find parts. I'd also recommend checking out Octopart when you're looking to find hard-to-find parts, because we take in the inventory lists of many of these brokers and independent distributors as well. That's all I had to talk about. So thanks for your time. And I also wanted to mention that Octopart is based here in NYC. We're actively hiring software engineers, salespeople. We're looking for designers. So if the intersection of software and hardware is interesting to you, please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can email us at jobs@octopart.com, email me at sam@octopart.com, or just come talk to me, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation. So thanks so much. Thanks, Matt.
So we have a few minutes for questions, and actually maybe just before starting, so I'm very grateful for a very interesting talk, to a talk that was not an advertisement for the company, which is was the tension here. But so you're almost to a fault, sort of modest and humble about what Octopart is. Do you want to tell us a little bit
Sure.
about the company?
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity. Yeah. Like I mentioned, Octopart is a search engine for electronic parts. So as you're looking for parts, we can tell you who has it in stock, what the prices are that day. We have data sheets. We have parametric search capabilities. we're really the place to go to when you're looking for parts. We also have an API, which allows third parties to pull down this information and use it for other applications in the supply chain. We also have a bill of materials manager, which can help with this product of procurement. It can help sync up your designers with the procurement side. And we work with over 180 component distributors. All of the major distributors I mentioned, we have really close relationships with. We take in their data feeds and make it available to cross-reference on our website, along with a lot of the independent distributors that I mentioned. We also have relationships with component manufacturers who send us their technical specifications, so you can find lots of information about components on our site.
Thank you. We're going to take the question. So just when you get the question, if you could repeat it, because this actually is a recording for the video.
Got it.
To your last point, do you do any certification or chain of custody of the parts that you're representing?
Yeah, so the question was, do we do any certification or chain of custody on the parts that we represent? One thing we do is we work with the Electronic Component Industry Association, the ECIA, which keeps a list of who are the authorized distributors. And they make the distributors present paperwork that shows that they have authorized relationships with component manufacturers. So we show an asterisk for the authorized distributors on the site. Now, not all distributors that are authorized to sell components are part of the ECIA, so we also will take certifications from component distributors and use that to determine whether we show an asterisk or not. That's the level at which we do. We also will indicate if a distributor holds stock themselves or if they just act as a broker, moving stock between excess lots and the end user. So we call those stocking distributors independent stocking distributors, and then we also have brokers that don't hold their own stock and don't have like an online store where you can go in and buy with a credit card.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
So how does the process affect the shipping time? Name a couple. Anil from US and Life. How does the process affect the shipping time for the parts? Does it affect because it needs to go to the distributor and then come?
Yeah. Yes. So the question was, how does shipping time? How is shipping time affected through these different parts of the supply chain, depending where you order them? If you're buying from an online distributor, you can get parts the next day. If you're buying larger quantities, oftentimes you'll have a sense of when you're going to need them, and you can work with your salesperson at a distributor or at a manufacturer and really make sure that the parts are delivered very close to the time when they're needed. And hard to find parts, oftentimes there'll be a very long lead time, or even parts that are in production, you can't get them right away. There might be 6 weeks, it might be 12 weeks lead time. Those are numbers you want to find out at the design phase, and you want to keep track of those numbers. Oftentimes, there can be events that are totally out of our control that can affect it. For example, the earthquake in Japan had major effects on shipping times of certain ships that were manufactured there, and we were able to see those lead times expand really quickly from the data that we're gathering from distributors. Yep.
How much room is there on price compared to like 1,000-unit price on Mauser or DigiKey for like a popular part, like a $2 or $3 microchip or something like that?
So the question is, how much room is there if you're buying on the order of 1,000 parts from a distributor like DigiKey or Mauser? Do you mean room between what you could get going directly to a salesperson, or?
Yeah, like doing any of these other techniques rather than maybe storing it from Mauser.
Yeah.
Could you get it for half the price, or is it more like maybe you get 5%
Yeah.
increasing your lead time in 30 days?
Yeah, it can be very significant, very significant. And I would say that it depends on how badly that component manufacturer wants their part designed into your device. The way to get the best deals is to really make a case to the manufacturer or to the manufacturer through your salesperson in distribution that your product is going to be big and that you want to get their part designed in. Like any negotiation, if you have alternatives, you're going to be in a better negotiating position. And so if it's a choice between manufacturer A and manufacturer B, and manufacturer A knows that, and they think your product is going to get big, you can see very significant discounts. And oftentimes, those parts are the most expensive parts in the device. And so it really behooves you to go down that road eventually when you're reaching significant volumes and you have some traction behind your product.
So that's all the time we have. Thank
Okay.
you very much.